The doorbell rang at exactly 7:15 p.m., 3 short, desperate rings that echoed through my spacious lakefront home. Through the security camera, I could see her standing on my porch, 2 battered suitcases at her feet, looking nothing like the confident woman who had cut me out of her life 5 years ago. My sister Vanessa, once the golden child of our family, now stood rain-soaked and desperate at my door. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I took a slow sip of my Cabernet, watching her through the camera as she rang again, more insistently this time. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all this time, after the surgery scars had faded and the feeling of abandonment had hardened into something colder, here she was, needing something from me again. "Are you going to answer that?" asked Thomas, my property manager, looking up from the renovation plans we'd been reviewing. "I'm considering my options," I replied, my finger hovering over the intercom button. 5 years ago, I'd given Vanessa my kidney, and 2 weeks after her recovery, she'd disappeared from my life, without explanation, taking our parents' support with her. Now she was the one in need, and I was the one with the power to help or turn away. I pressed the intercom. "I'll be right there." The expression on Vanessa's face when I opened the door told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't expected the sprawling lake house, the obvious success, or the calm composure with which I greeted her. The sister she'd abandoned had been struggling financially, working at a local bookstore, and living in a cramped apartment in Milwaukee. That version of me, Catherine Mitchell, the reliable but unremarkable younger sister, no longer existed. "Katie," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "you look different." I studied her without hurry. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a faded sweater and jeans. Her once perfect hair hung limp around her face, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. The golden child had lost her shine. "It's Catherine now," I corrected her calmly. "Only friends call me Katie." Rain continued to pour behind her, streaming down from the darkening April sky. In the distance, thunder rolled across Lake Michigan. Despite everything, seeing her shivering on my doorstep stirred something in me. A reflex of compassion I thought I'd buried long ago. "You should come inside," I said finally, stepping back to allow her entry. "The storm's getting worse." Relief washed over her face as she dragged her suitcases into the foyer, water pooling beneath them on the marble tiles. Her eyes darted around, taking in the soaring ceilings, the artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, all evidence of a life that had flourished in her absence. Thomas cleared his throat discreetly from the living room doorway. "Should I come back tomorrow to finish reviewing the expansion plans, Ms. Mitchell?" "That would be best, Thomas. Thank you." I maintained my composure even as Vanessa's eyebrows rose at his formal address. After he gathered his documents and left, silence settled between us, heavy with 5 years of unspoken words. "You've done well for yourself," Vanessa finally offered, gesturing vaguely at the house. "Yes." I didn't elaborate. "Why are you here, Vanessa?" She flinched at my directness, then seemed to deflate further. "Mom didn't tell you?" "Mom and I don't speak much these days. Not since you convinced her I was exaggerating about my recovery issues." The words came out colder than I'd intended, but I didn't regret them. Vanessa looked away, guilt flashing across her face. "I'm sorry about that. I really am. I wasn't thinking clearly back then." "Clearly enough to take the beach house in the divorce settlement," I pointed out. "The beach house Dad promised would be mine someday." 5 years ago, when Vanessa's kidneys were failing, our family had rallied around her. I'd been tested and found to be a perfect match, a fact my parents had treated as my sacred duty rather than my choice. The recovery had been harder than anyone had prepared me for. While Vanessa regained her health, I'd lost my job due to extended absence and developed complications that left me with chronic pain for nearly a year. When I'd needed support, Vanessa had already moved on, telling our parents I was being dramatic, for attention. 3 months later, she'd convinced our father to transfer the deed of his cherished Michigan beach house to her instead of me, a property he'd always promised would be my inheritance. By the time I'd recovered enough to confront her, she'd sold it to finance her husband Jason's business venture and stopped returning my calls. I made mistakes, Vanessa admitted, her voice small. Terrible ones. But I'm desperate, Catherine. Jason left me 3 months ago. The business failed. I've got nothing left. I walked to the kitchen, expecting her to follow, which she did tentatively. I poured her a glass of water, not yet ready to offer the comfort of wine. Where are Mom and Dad in all this? Surely they'd welcome their favorite daughter with open arms. I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Vanessa stared into her water glass. They don't know how bad it is. Dad's health isn't good. His heart condition is worse. Mom's completely focused on him. I didn't want to add to their stress. How considerate, I murmured, leaning against the counter. So instead, you thought you'd turn to the sister you ghosted after taking her kidney. The one you told Mom was just seeking attention when she couldn't get out of bed without help. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. I know it sounds awful when you put it that way. Is there another way to put it? She shook her head, a tear sliding down her cheek. No, you're right. I was horrible to you. After everything you did for me, I treated you like you were nothing. I can't explain it except to say I was terrified of facing what I owed you. It was easier to pretend you were the problem than to admit how much I'd taken from you. The rain lashed against the windows as I considered her words. Outside, lightning illuminated the churning lake waters. The storm matched my internal turbulence, anger, and resentment battling against the ingrained habit of being Vanessa's protector. What exactly do you need? I asked finally. A place to stay for a while, just until I can find work and get back on my feet. She gestured to her suitcases. Everything I own is right there. The bank foreclosed on our house last month. I've been staying in motels, but my savings ran out yesterday. I took a slow sip of my wine, studying her over the rim of the glass. And Jason? Where is he in all this? Left me for his assistant, she said with a bitter laugh. Classic, right? He started the affair while I was still dealing with medication adjustment issues from the transplant. By the time the business failed, he was already planning his exit strategy. Despite everything, a flicker of sympathy stirred in me. I remembered the early days after her diagnosis, before the surgery, when Vanessa's fear had been raw and real, before she'd decided that moving forward meant leaving me behind. I have a guest suite in the East Wing, I said finally. You can stay there temporarily while we figure out next steps. Relief washed over her face. Thank you, Catherine. I promise I won't be a burden. I can help around the house or, with your work, whatever you need. I have staff for the house, I replied, seeing her surprise. As for my work, we'll discuss that tomorrow. You should get settled and dry off. The bathroom in the guest suite has everything you'll need. As I showed her to the East Wing, I could feel her burning with questions about my apparent success, but exhaustion seemed to overpower her curiosity. At the door to the guest suite, she paused. I know saying sorry isn't enough, she said quietly, but I am sorry, Catherine. For everything. I nodded without committing to forgiveness. Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning. Returning to the living room, I refilled my wine glass and stood before the windows, watching lightning spiders across the sky. The lake house was my sanctuary, purchased 2 years ago with the proceeds from my now thriving business, Mitchell Literary Management. What had started as a desperate pivot from retail to freelance editing during my recovery had evolved into representing authors whose words helped heal my spirit when my family had abandoned me. My phone buzzed with a text from Ellie, my assistant. Anderson contract finalized. $2 million advance secured. Still need to postpone the Chicago trip next week? I typed back, yes. Family situation developing. We'll brief you tomorrow. Family situation. The words felt foreign after years of deliberate distance. Vanessa's reappearance threatened the careful boundaries I'd established, the emotional fortress I'd built around the memory of her betrayal. The rain continued to pound against the windows as night settled fully over the lake. I picked up the renovation plans Thomas had left, an expansion of the property to include a writer's retreat for my clients. Success was the best revenge, people said. But standing in my beautiful home with my estranged sister sleeping in my guest suite, I wasn't sure if I felt victorious or simply tired of carrying the weight of our fractured relationship. My phone buzzed again, a text from my mother. Vanessa said she's staying with you. Thank you for helping her. Your father will be relieved. 5 years of minimal contact, and this was what broke her silence. Concern for Vanessa. The familiar sting of being the afterthought. Child resurfaced. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the security system controls. With a few clicks, I restricted access to my home office and the western wing where my bedroom was located. Trust was earned, not given. A lesson Vanessa had taught me at great personal cost. Morning arrived with clearer skies and the sound of movement in the kitchen. I'd expected Vanessa to sleep late, exhausted from whatever journey had brought her to my doorstep. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Instead, I found her attempting to cook breakfast, looking lost among my professional-grade appliances. The coffee maker requires an engineering degree, she joked weakly when she saw me. There's a reason I have a housekeeper, I replied, stepping in to press the correct sequence of buttons. The machine hummed to life. Mrs. Winters comes at 9. She'll be surprised to find a guest. Vanessa's attempt at normalcy faded. I should have called first. I just didn't know if you'd agree to see me. A fair concern. I leaned against the counter, still in my silk pajamas and robe, a small luxury I'd denied myself in leaner times. So, what's the plan, Vanessa? How long is while in your mind? She looked down at her hands. I honestly don't know. I've applied for jobs in the area, but nothing's come through yet. My resume has a pretty significant gap since I was helping Jason with the business. Off the books, of course. What was? The business? I realized I knew almost nothing about her life these past 5 years. High-end furniture imports. It was doing well until Jason started gambling with the profits. Turns out he was taking business trips to Vegas, not vendor meetings in Chicago. Her voice held the flatness of someone who'd exhausted their capacity for shock. By the time I figured it out, we were underwater. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured 2 cups, sliding one toward her. And your health? The kidney? Still functioning perfectly, she said quietly. The doctors say your kidney is exceptionally healthy. They call it the overachiever. Of course they did. Even my organ outperformed expectations once it was in. Vanessa's body. I've kept up with all my medications and appointments, she added. That was non-negotiable, even when we couldn't pay other bills. At least she hadn't abused my physical sacrifice, even if she'd discarded the emotional one. I have meetings this morning, I said, changing the subject. My assistant will be here. At 8? You're welcome to use the common areas of the house, but my office is off limits. Mrs. Winters can show you where everything is. Vanessa nodded, clearly sensing that pushing for more warmth would be a mistake. What exactly do you do now? This house suggests it's something more significant than the bookstore. I allowed myself a small smile. I own Mitchell Literary Management. We represent about 30 authors, mostly in fiction and memoir. Her eyes widened. You're in publishing? Since when? Since I had to reinvent myself after losing my bookstore job during my recovery. I didn't add that the extended absence and inability to stand for long periods had been the direct result of donating my kidney to her. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. That's amazing, Catherine. I always knew you had a gift with books. But this is the result of necessary adaptation, I finished for her. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for my day. In my office, secured by a keypad that Vanessa didn't have the code for, I settled into the familiar rhythm of work. 3 manuscript reviews, a contract negotiation, and a strategy call. With a debut author whose novel was sparking a bidding war. By noon, I'd nearly forgotten the emotional complexity waiting outside my door. Nearly, but not quite. A knock interrupted me just after my last call. Ellie stood in the doorway, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your sister is asking if you're free for lunch," she said. She mentioned something about wanting to talk about job possibilities in the area. Ellie knew the bare outlines of my family history, enough to understand why I tensed at the mention of Vanessa. At 28, she was 6 years my junior and fiercely protective of the company we'd built together. She'd started as my assistant 3 years ago and had quickly become indispensable. "Tell her I'm on call until 2, I replied. "And Ellie, could you run a discreet background check? Financial history, legal issues, the usual client screening, but for Vanessa Mitchell-Stevens." Ellie nodded, unsurprised. "We vetted potential. Clients thoroughly? Why would family be any different?" "On it. Anything specific I should look for?" "Anything that explains why she's really here," I said. "She's told me her husband left and she's broke. But Vanessa has always had layers of motivation." When Ellie left, I turned to the lake view, allowing myself a moment of reflection. 5 years ago, I'd been the one asking Vanessa for help, for a place to stay while I recovered, for financial support when medical bills mounted, for emotional understanding when pain left me depressed and anxious. She'd had excuses then. The stress of her own recovery, Jason's discomfort with having me in their home, her need to move forward rather than dwell on illness. Now our positions were reversed. I had the resources, the stable life, the power to help or refuse. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, nor was the opportunity it presented. Not for revenge, exactly, but for something I'd never had with Vanessa. Equilibrium. By the time I emerged for our delayed lunch at 3, I'd made a decision. This unexpected reunion wasn't just Vanessa's crisis. It was my chance to finally address the imbalance that had defined our relationship since childhood. One way or another, things between us would change. What Vanessa didn't know, couldn't know, was just how much power I now held, not just in my success, but in information she thought was safely buried in the past. Lunch with Vanessa was a careful dance of politeness masking deeper currents. We sat on the covered patio overlooking the lake, where waves still churned from the previous night's storm. Mrs. Winters had prepared a light meal, cucumber soup, artisan bread, and a summer salad, before discreetly withdrawing to continue her work. "This place is incredible," Vanessa said, breaking a silence that had stretched too long. "The view alone must have cost a fortune." "Property values were down when I purchased it," I replied, not mentioning that down still meant 7 figures. The timing worked out in my favor. Vanessa nodded, pushing her soup spoon through the cucumber puree without eating. "You mentioned your company, Mitchell Literary Management. How did that happen?" "Last I knew, you were working at Reader's Corner." I considered how much to share. The full story involved depths of struggle Vanessa had never bothered to learn, about months of physical pain, financial precarity, and the brutal realization that I was entirely on my own. "Necessity," I said finally. After losing my position at the bookstore, I started freelance editing from my apartment. One client led to another. When I helped novelist Margot Winters revise a manuscript that started a bidding war, she suggested I become her agent instead of her editor. I didn't mention that Margot had found me through an online forum where I'd been offering editing services at desperate rates to make rent. or that I'd worked from a studio apartment where I sometimes couldn't afford to run the air conditioning during Chicago's sweltering summers. Margot Winters? The Margot Winters? Vanessa looked genuinely impressed. Her last book was everywhere. I saw her on Good Morning America talking about the movie adaptation. She was my first major client. Now we represent 32 authors with a wait list for new submissions. I allowed myself a moment of pride. The company had grown beyond my wildest expectations, built from nothing but determination and a refusal to be defeated by circumstances, including Vanessa's abandonment. That's amazing, Catherine, truly. Her expression softened. I always knew you were smart, but this is exceptional. The compliment felt hollow after years of being treated as an afterthought. When we were growing up, Vanessa had been the beautiful one, the charismatic one, while I was the reliable, bookish sister whose achievements were acknowledged but never celebrated. Our parents had attended every one of Vanessa's dance recitals and tennis matches, but my academic honors had merited little more than distracted congratulations. You mentioned looking for work, I said, changing the subject. What kind of positions are you considering? Vanessa's shoulders tensed slightly. Anything, really. I was handling the administrative side of Jason's business, accounts, client relations, logistics. Before that, I worked in event planning for a hotel chain. With a 5-year gap in formal employment, I observed. Yes. She looked down at her. Barely touched lunch. It's been challenging to get interviews. I took a sip of water, calculating my next move. The background check Ellie was running would tell me more, but I already suspected Vanessa wasn't sharing everything. Tell me what happened with Jason, I said. The full story, not the glossed-over version. Vanessa flinched, then seemed to deflate. The business was in trouble long before he left. He'd been gambling with company funds for at least 2 years. When our biggest supplier demanded payment and we couldn't deliver, everything unraveled. She pushed her plate away, appetite apparently gone. Jason blamed me, if you can believe it. Said if I hadn't been sick, if we hadn't spent so much on my medical care early in our marriage, he wouldn't have needed to take financial risks. Then, I found out he'd been sleeping with his assistant for months. Her laugh was bitter. He moved in with her the same day he told me the business was bankrupt. Despite everything, a flicker of sympathy stirred in me. Vanessa had always believed her beauty and charm would shield her from life's harsh realities. The betrayal must have shattered her self-image. And Mom and Dad? You said Dad's health is worse, but surely they could help financially. Vanessa's expression grew complicated. They don't know how bad it is. After the divorce, I told them I was doing fine. Dad's heart condition has worsened in the past year. He can barely leave the house now. Mom's completely focused on his care. So, they think you're here for a friendly visit, I concluded, not because you have nowhere else to go. She nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. I couldn't bear for them to know how badly I've failed. Dad always said Jason was unreliable, that I was making a mistake choosing him over. She stopped abruptly, but I finished for her. Over Richard. Richard Hayes had been Vanessa's college boyfriend, the sensible pre-med student our parents had adored. The one who wanted you to postpone the wedding until he finished medical school. Yes. Vanessa twisted her napkin. Richard is a cardiology specialist now. He's actually Dad's doctor. The irony wasn't lost on me. Vanessa had chosen the charming entrepreneur over the steady medical student against our parents' wishes, perhaps their only instance of disapproving of her choices. When was the last time you spoke with Mom and Dad? I asked. Last week. Mom calls every Sunday. Vanessa looked at me curiously. What about you? Christmas. Briefly. And Dad's birthday is in February. The calls had been stilted, centered on safe topics like weather and books. Nothing about my success, nothing about the past, certainly nothing about the kidney. A silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken histories. On the lake, a sailboat tacked against the wind, its white sail bright against the gray-blue water. "I should let you get back to work," Vanessa said, finally. "Thank you for lunch, and again for letting me stay." "We need to establish some parameters," I replied, my tone professional. "This arrangement is temporary, 2 weeks to start. You'll need to actively search for employment. I can provide housing and basic necessities but not spend money." She nodded quickly. "Of course. I've already applied for several positions, and I have an interview tomorrow at the Lakeside Hotel for an event coordination role." "Good." I stood, gathering my plate. "I have calls until 6, then dinner with a client. In the city. We can talk more tomorrow." As I turned to go, Vanessa's voice stopped me. "Catherine, do they know? Your friends? Your colleagues? Do they know about the kidney?" The question caught me off guard. "No, it's not relevant to my professional life." "You never told anyone what you did for me?" Her voice held genuine surprise. "Why would I? The people in my life now value me for who I am and what I've built, not for parts of myself I've given away." The words came out sharper than intended, but I didn't retract them. In my office, I found Ellie waiting with a tablet and a concerned expression. "You ran the background check on my sister?" I asked, closing the door behind me. She nodded, handing me the tablet. "It's complicated. The business bankruptcy is real, filed 8 months ago. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago, as she said. But there's more." I scrolled through the report, a knot forming in my stomach as the details emerged. Jason hadn't just gambled away business funds. He'd taken out loans in the company's name, using their house as collateral. The bankruptcy filing included creditor claims exceeding $2.4 million. And there, buried in the legal notices, was a detail Vanessa had conveniently omitted. She had been named as co-defendant in a lawsuit filed by their primary investor, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation. "She's being sued?" I looked up at Ellie, who nodded grimly. "The investor claims she was equally involved in misrepresenting the company's financial status to secure additional funding. The case is pending, but if the judgment goes against her, she could be liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars," I finished, understanding now the desperation that had driven Vanessa to my door. This wasn't just about needing temporary housing. She was potentially facing financial ruin and legal consequences. The report contained another surprise. 6 weeks ago, Vanessa had applied for a position at Horizon Publishing, one of our biggest client publishers. She'd used my name as a reference, claiming to be intimately familiar with Mitchell Literary Management's operations. "She tried to leverage her connection to you without permission," Ellie observed. "Horizon's HR director called me to verify her claims. I said I had no information about Vanessa Stevens. The calculated nature of it made my chest tighten. Even now, Vanessa saw me primarily as a resource to be used." "There's one more thing," Ellie added, hesitating. "It may be nothing, but the timing seemed odd. 2 days after she applied to Horizon, someone tried to access our client database using my credentials. Our security system blocked it, but the attempt came from an IP address in Indianapolis, where Vanessa was living," I said quietly. "Yes, like I said, it could be coincidental. But you don't believe in coincidences, and neither do I." I set down the tablet, my mind racing. "Thank you, Ellie. This is exactly what I needed to know." After she left, I stood at the window, processing this new information. The sister sleeping in my guest suite wasn't just a victim of her husband's poor decisions. She was potentially complicit in fraud and had possibly attempted to access my company's confidential information. Worse, she'd tried to use me as a professional reference without my knowledge, potentially damaging my reputation with an important business partner. The question was, what did she want now? Simple shelter until she found work, or something more? Calculated. By the time I left for my dinner meeting in Chicago, I'd decided on a course of action. Vanessa had always operated in her own self-interest, regardless of the cost to others. This time, I will be prepared. The Blackbird restaurant buzzed with the energy of Chicago's literary elite. I spotted my client Aidan Turner at our reserved table, his latest manuscript, a psychological thriller already generating pre-publication buzz, tucked beside him. "Catherine, you're looking particularly formidable this evening," he greeted me with his characteristic directness. "A necessary state of being in publishing," I replied with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Aidan, perceptive as always, tilted his head. "Something's wrong. Not with the manuscript, I hope." "The manuscript is excellent. It's a personal matter." I signaled the waiter for wine. "Ah, the mysterious personal life of Catherine Mitchell." He leaned back. "I've always wondered what happens when you're not terrorizing publishers into submission on behalf of your authors." Despite my mood, I laughed. Aidan had been with the agency for 2 years, and his success had helped cement our reputation for representing commercially viable literary fiction. More importantly, he'd become something of a friend, as much as I allowed anyone into that category. My estranged sister has reappeared after 5 years, looking for help. I surprised myself by sharing even that much. Aidan's eyebrows rose. "I didn't know you had a sister." "Few people do. We're not close." I accepted the wine the server poured, taking a moment to appreciate its rich complexity. "She's staying with me temporarily while sorting out some difficulties." "The kind that requires your particular brand of problem-solving or the mundane financial sort?" "Potentially both." I studied him over my glass. "What would you do if someone who had previously betrayed you suddenly needed your help?" Aidan, whose novels often explored moral ambiguity, considered the question seriously. "I suppose it depends on the nature of the betrayal and whether they acknowledge it." "Unacknowledged. Betrayal tends to repeat itself." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. Vanessa had apologized, but had she truly acknowledged the depth of what she'd done? The way she'd taken my sacrifice, then discarded me when I became inconvenient? She needed something from me. Something only I could give, I said carefully. After she got it, she cut me out of her life completely. Now she needs something else. Understanding dawned in Aidan's eyes. "And you're wondering if helping her is compassion or foolishness?" "Exactly." "In my next book, the protagonist faces a similar dilemma with her brother," he said, tapping the manuscript. "She chooses to help him, but on her terms, with clear boundaries and expectations. It's not forgiveness exactly, but a renegotiation of their relationship." "And does it work?" I asked, genuinely curious. Aidan smiled enigmatically. "You'll have to read the final draft to find out. But between us, I think the only way to move forward with people who have hurt us is to change the terms of engagement. You can't erase history, but you can create new patterns." The conversation shifted to his manuscript and upcoming publicity plans, but his words stayed with me throughout the evening. Renegotiating the relationship, creating new patterns, terms of engagement. By the time I returned home, a plan had begun to form. One that would test both Vanessa's sincerity and my own capacity for strategic compassion. The house was quiet, a single lamp illuminating the foyer. I disarmed the security system and reset it, noting that the guest suite light was still on. As I passed, I heard Vanessa's voice, low and urgent. She was on the phone. "I know, but I need more time," she was saying. "My sister's place is perfect. It's isolated, right on the lake. Yes, she has money. More than we thought." I froze, listening. "No, she doesn't suspect anything. She thinks I'm desperate, which I am, but not the way she thinks. Just give me 2 weeks to figure out the details." My breath caught. The background check was right. This wasn't a simple request for temporary shelter. Vanessa had an agenda. "I have to go," she said suddenly, her voice dropping further. "I'll call when I know more." I moved silently past the door, my mind racing. Whatever Vanessa was planning, she clearly wasn't alone in it. And judging by the conversation, it involved me, my home, and my money. In my bedroom, I pulled out my phone and texted Ellie. Add security monitoring to the guest wing. Full access restrictions to main house systems. Background check on Jason. Stevens, look deeper than public records. This wasn't just about setting boundaries anymore. It was about protecting myself from whatever scheme Vanessa was orchestrating. The sister who had taken my kidney and walked away without a backward glance was now targeting something else. And this time, I wouldn't be caught unprepared. I stared out at the dark lake, remembering the day I'd agreed to the donation. Vanessa had wept with gratitude, promising a bond between us that would never break. "You're saving my life," she'd said. "I'll never forget this." But she had forgotten, or worse, had remembered and still chosen to discard me when I became inconvenient. Now she was back, her gratitude replaced by calculation. The realization settled cold and hard. The sister I'd once protected, the one I'd sacrificed for, saw me as nothing more than an opportunity to exploit. The question was no longer whether to help her, but how to expose whatever she was planning before she could cause further damage. Tomorrow, I will begin my own operation, one designed to uncover the truth about Vanessa's sudden reappearance and the mysterious phone call that revealed her true intentions. This time, I would be the one setting the terms of our relationship, and those terms would be designed to protect what I'd built from the person who had already taken too much from me. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as I prepared coffee, my mind clear despite the revelations of the previous night. I'd slept surprisingly well, perhaps because uncertainty had been replaced with purpose. Vanessa was planning something, and now so was I. The security system had been upgraded overnight. A call to my contractor had ensured that. New cameras covered the guest wing and exterior approaches to my office. Access codes had been changed, and a silent alert would now notify me if anyone attempted to enter restricted areas. "Good morning," Vanessa said brightly, appearing in the doorway in borrowed running clothes. "I hope you don't mind. I found these in the guest suite closet. I thought I'd jog along the lake path." I gestured to the coffee machine. "Help yourself." The path extends 3 miles north before looping back. Mrs. Winters left fruit and yogurt in the fridge for breakfast. Vanessa poured coffee, studying me over the rim of her cup. "You look nice. Important meetings today?" "I'm hosting a writer's workshop this afternoon. 6 of our authors are flying in to discuss marketing strategies for their fall releases." The event had been planned for months, but now it served an additional purpose in my developing strategy. "Here at the house?" Vanessa asked with forced casualness. "At our downtown office. You'll have the place to yourself until evening." I watched her expression carefully, noting the flash of something, disappointment, in her eyes. "Unless you have your job interview today." "Tomorrow," she corrected quickly. "The Lakeside Hotel rescheduled. I thought I might explore the area. Today, get my bearings." "Of course." I picked up my briefcase. "Mrs. Winters leaves at 3. The security system will arm automatically. Your temporary code only disarms the guest wing entrance." Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. "Pretty serious. Security for a literary agent. We represent several high-profile clients whose work attracts both fervent fans and occasional threats." I didn't mention the real reason for the security upgrade. "Enjoy your run. I'll be back around 8. Outside, I texted Ellie. "Vanessa, we'll be alone at the house today. Monitor the security feeds. If she tries to access my office or main systems, let me know immediately." In the car, I made a call I'd been considering since overhearing Vanessa's late-night conversation. "Richard, it's Catherine Mitchell." "Yes, Vanessa's sister. I was hoping we might meet for coffee today. It's about my father's care." "Dr. Richard." Hayes agreed immediately, his concern for my father's cardiac condition overriding any awkwardness about his history with Vanessa. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near Northwestern Memorial Hospital during his lunch break. My morning at the office passed in a blur of preparation for the author's workshop. By noon, I was sliding into a booth across from Richard Hayes, who looked exactly as I remembered from Vanessa's college graduation, tall, serious, and meticulously put together, though now with threads of gray at his temples. "Catherine," he greeted me warmly. "It's been, 7 years? You look well." "Life has been kind recently," I replied with a measured smile. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice." "Of course. Your father is one of my priority patients." His expression grew more serious. "His condition has stabilized, but the progression of his cardiomyopathy is concerning. Has Vanessa updated you?" The question confirmed my suspicion that Richard believed Vanessa and I were in regular contact. "Not in detail. We've been somewhat estranged in recent years." Richard's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry to hear that. She mentioned you were close, especially after the transplant. So Vanessa had discussed the kidney donation with him. Interesting. The transplant actually marked the beginning of our estrangement. But that's not why I asked to meet." I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. "Vanessa arrived at my home unexpectedly 2 days ago. She's staying with me temporarily while sorting out some issues following her divorce." "Divorce?" Richard looked genuinely surprised. "I knew she'd married Jason Stevens against your parents' advice, but I wasn't aware they'd separated. Finalized 3 months ago, according to records." I watched his reaction. "Jason's business failed, leaving significant debt. Vanessa claims our parents don't know the extent of her situation." Richard frowned. "That's concerning. Your father's condition is aggravated by stress. Learning his daughter is in financial trouble would certainly qualify." "My thoughts exactly. I'm trying to understand the full picture before anyone discusses this with my parents." I paused, then added, "Has Vanessa been in contact with you recently? Perhaps about my father's care?" He shook his head. "Not for at least 6 months. She occasionally attends appointments with your parents, but the last time was January, I believe. That timeline didn't align with Vanessa's claim of active involvement in our father's care. Another lie, or at least an exaggeration." "One more question, Richard. In your professional opinion, how much would medical costs factor into my father's financial planning at this point? Are they facing significant out-of-pocket expenses?" He looked thoughtful. "Your father has excellent insurance through his retirement plan. The new medication regimen isn't cheap, but it's mostly covered. Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand all aspects of the situation." I changed the subject smoothly. "Now tell me more about Dad's current treatment. I'd like to be better informed." By the time we parted, I had confirmed several key points. Vanessa had exaggerated her involvement in our father's care. Our parents' financial situation wasn't as strained as she had implied, and Richard Hayes still harbored enough affection for the Mitchell family to be a potentially useful ally. "Catherine," Richard said as we prepared to leave, "I've always regretted losing touch with your family after Vanessa and I ended things. If there's anything I can do to help, with your father's care or other matters, please don't hesitate to ask." I shook his hand, sensing an opportunity. "Actually, there is something. If Vanessa contacts you, I'd appreciate knowing what she says, for my parents' sake." He nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "Of course." Back at the office, the author's workshop was already underway in our conference room. 6 writers, ranging from a debut novelist to Margot Winters, now on her 5th bestseller, were engaged in animated discussion about marketing strategies. "Catherine," Margot called when I entered. "Perfect timing. We're debating the value of book talk for literary fiction. Your opinion is needed." I slid into the conversation seamlessly, but part of my mind remained focused on the Vanessa situation. During a break, I checked my phone to find a text from Ellie. "V attempted access to home office. Code failed. She then spent 20 minutes on the phone in the garden. Audio surveillance captured partial conversation, something about documents, and proof of ownership. Full report when you return. My suspicions deepened. What documents was Vanessa looking for? What ownership was she trying to prove? As the workshop wrapped up, I made an announcement. As you know, we're planning a writer's retreat next month at my lake house. Given everyone's enthusiasm today, I'd like to invite you all to a preliminary gathering this Saturday, an informal dinner to continue these discussions in a more relaxed setting. The invitation was met with enthusiasm, particularly from Margot, who had been pushing for more community-building events among our authors. "I'll bring that Bordeaux I've been saving," she promised. "Perfect," I replied. "And please, feel free to bring your manuscripts in progress. The house has several peaceful nooks ideal for writing." The plan was taking shape. If Vanessa was indeed targeting my home or business, the presence of multiple witnesses, accomplished, observant writers with sharp eyes for detail, would either deter her or help document whatever she attempted. The time I arrived home that evening, I had arranged not only Saturday's gathering but also a meeting with my attorney for the following morning. Whatever Vanessa was planning, I would be legally fortified against it. The house was quiet when I entered, but the scent of cooking led me to the kitchen, where Vanessa stood stirring something on the stove. "I made dinner," she announced, gesturing to a pot of what appeared to be homemade pasta sauce. "Mrs. Winters showed me where everything was before she left. I hope you don't mind." "That was thoughtful," I replied, setting down my briefcase. "How was your day?" "Productive," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I explored the neighborhood, updated my resume, and had a phone interview with a catering company. In Highland Park, they're looking for an event coordinator. All activities that would legitimately explain her movements around the house and her phone calls. Convenient. The security system alerted me that someone tried to access my office," I mentioned casually, watching her reaction. Vanessa's hand paused momentarily in her stirring. "Oh. That might have been me, actually. I was looking for you earlier. I thought you might have come home for lunch. I must have tried the wrong door. This place is like a maze." The lie came smoothly, without hesitation or visible discomfort. Vanessa had always been skilled at deception when necessary. "An easy mistake," I replied, matching her casual tone. "The office requires a separate code. Client confidentiality." "Of course," she returned to the sauce. "How was your workshop? Inspiring future bestsellers?" "Always the goal. In fact, I've invited the group for dinner this Saturday. They're eager to experience the lake house setting. Many of them incorporate similar locations in their work." Vanessa's spoon clattered against the pot. "This Saturday? Here? Is that a problem?" "No, not at all," she recovered quickly. I was thinking of driving to Indianapolis this weekend to pick up some additional belongings from a storage unit." "I thought the bank foreclosed on everything," I observed. "Most things, yes. But I managed to store some personal items, photo albums, keepsakes. Nothing valuable, just sentimental." She shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "But it can wait. Your dinner sounds important." I considered this new information. Was the storage unit real, or an excuse for a meeting with whoever had been on the other end of those phone calls? "Why don't you join us?" I suggested, testing her reaction. "Several of our authors are interested in the human elements of medical stories. Your experience with kidney failure and transplantation might provide valuable insight." Alarm flashed across her face before she controlled it. "I don't know, Catherine. It seems like a professional gathering. I wouldn't want to intrude." "Not an intrusion at all. In fact, I insist." I kept my tone light but firm. "It would be good for you to meet people in my circle. Networking opportunities." Vanessa turned back to the stove, her shoulders tense. "If you're sure, though I don't think my medical history is appropriate for dinner conversation. We're writers. And agents, Vanessa. Everything is potential material. I took a wine glass from the cabinet. When is your interview at the Lakeside Hotel? Tomorrow at 11, she replied, clearly relieved by the change of subject. I'm nervous, honestly. It's been so long since I've done a formal interview. What will you tell them about your employment? Gap? She poured the sauce over 2 plates of pasta. That I was managing a small import business that unfortunately failed due to market conditions. Not exactly a lie. And the pending lawsuit? Will you mention that? The plate she was holding froze midair. What lawsuit? I took the plate from her hand, setting it on the counter. The one filed by your primary investor, naming both Jason and you as defendants for fraudulent misrepresentation. The one seeking damages of approximately $800,000. Color drained from Vanessa's face. How did you... I run background checks on everyone associated with my business, Vanessa. Even family, especially a family with a history of dishonesty. She sank into a kitchen chair. It's not what you think. Jason falsified those investor documents. I had no idea until it was too late. Yet you signed them as co-owner, I noted, taking the seat across from her. Just as you signed as guarantor on the business loans that used your house as collateral. I trusted him, she whispered. My husband. You're supposed to trust your husband. Despite myself, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Vanessa had always been trusting to the point of naivete when it came to people she loved. It was her greatest vulnerability, one Jason had apparently exploited fully. Why didn't you tell me about the lawsuit when you arrived? I asked. Why present this as simply needing temporary housing? She met my eyes, hers swimming with tears that seemed genuine. Would you have let me stay if you knew? I was afraid, Catherine. I'm still afraid. If the judgment goes against me, I'll lose everything. Not that there's much left to lose. The raw emotion in her voice gave me pause. Was this the real Vanessa breaking through or another performance? And the phone calls? I pressed. The one last night where you mentioned my money and this house being perfect? The one today about documents and proof of ownership? Her expression shifted from despair to shock. You've been monitoring my calls? I've been protecting myself, I corrected. After what happened 5 years ago, surely you can understand why I might be cautious about your sudden reappearance in my life. Vanessa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It's not what you think. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. Then explain. She hesitated, then sighed deeply. It's complicated, Catherine, and not entirely my story to tell. Can you give me until after my interview tomorrow? There's someone I need to speak with first, someone who can help explain everything. Was a delay tactic, likely to give her time to construct a more convincing lie or to warn whoever she was working with. But forcing a confrontation now might cause her to retreat without revealing the full scope of whatever she was planning. Until tomorrow evening, I agreed, my tone making it clear this was a deadline, not a suggestion. After that, I expect complete honesty, or you'll need to find alternative accommodation. Relief flooded her features. Thank you. I promise. There's an explanation for everything. We ate dinner in relative silence, the pasta cooling as tension hung between us. When Vanessa excused herself early, claiming interview anxiety, I didn't object. Alone in the kitchen, I called Ellie for the full security report. The recorded phone conversation had indeed mentioned documents related to ownership, specifically property ownership records for the lake house and something called the trust. I hadn't mentioned trust during our confrontation. That detail, unaccounted for in Vanessa's emotional response, suggested there was indeed more to this situation than she was admitting. As I reviewed the property deeds and legal documentation for my home, all securely in my name with no encumbrances, a text arrived from Richard Hayes. Vanessa called, asked detailed questions about your father's estate planning and whether I knew of any trusts established for the children. Claimed she was helping update family records. Suspicious timing given our conversation. The pieces were starting to align, revealing a picture more complex than simple financial desperation. Vanessa wasn't just seeking temporary shelter. She was hunting for something specific, something she believed entitled her to a portion of what I'd built. Tomorrow's deadline would force her hand one way or another. But tonight, I had preparation to do. Opening my laptop, I began drafting instructions for my attorney. If Vanessa was searching for documents, perhaps it was time to create some of my own, ones that would protect my interests while revealing exactly what my sister was after. Dawn broke over the lake with streaks of pink and gold as I completed my morning swim, cutting through the cool water with practiced strokes. These early morning swims had become ritual during my recovery after the kidney donation, first as rehabilitation, then as affirmation of my returning strength. Now, they serve as meditation, clearing my mind for the challenges ahead. As I toweled off on the private dock, my phone buzzed with a text from my attorney, Diane Sawyer. No relation to the journalist, as she often joked. Documents prepared as requested. Meeting still on for 9:30? I confirmed the appointment, then headed inside. Vanessa was already in the kitchen, dressed in a conservative navy suit for her job interview, nervously checking her reflection in a compact mirror. "Do I look employed enough?" she asked with forced lightness. "It's been so long since I've done this." "The suit works," I replied, pouring coffee. "Though you might want to remove the designer watch if you're claiming financial hardship." She glanced down at her wrist, a Cartier tank watch that had been a 5-year anniversary gift from Jason. "Right. Good point." She slipped it off, tucking it into her purse. "Any advice for the interview?" "Be honest about your qualifications," I suggested, emphasizing the word honest slightly. "The Lakeside has high standards for their event staff." Vanessa nodded, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "About last night. I know I promised an explanation this evening, but I was wondering if we could push it to tomorrow. The person I need to speak with isn't available until late tonight." This delay tactic was predictable. "No," I said firmly. "Our agreement stands. I have dinner meetings through next week, and Saturday is the authors' gathering. Tonight is the deadline? But non-negotiable, Vanessa. You're staying in my home under increasingly suspicious circumstances. I've been more than accommodating." She sighed, shoulders slumping. "Fine. Tonight." She gathered her purse and interview materials. "I should get going. Traffic to Highland Park will be brutal this time of morning." "Good luck," I offered, not entirely insincerely. A legitimate job would add credibility to her claim of simply needing temporary support. After she left, I called Ellie. "Monitor her movements today. If she deviates from the Lakeside Hotel before or after the interview time, I want to know." "Already on it," Ellie replied. "I have a contact in their HR department who'll confirm if she actually shows up. Also, we've got a hit on the background search for Jason Stevens. You're going to want to see this." My meeting with Diane Sawyer took place in her sleek downtown Chicago office, with views of the river and the architectural marvels of the city skyline. At 58, Diane had built her reputation by handling complex cases with surgical precision, exactly what I needed now. "So your estranged sister, the one who ghosted you after you donated a kidney, has suddenly reappeared claiming financial hardship," Diane summarized, reviewing the documents I'd provided. "But you've discovered she's making inquiries about property ownership and something called the trust, which you know nothing about." "Correct," I confirmed. "She's also facing a major lawsuit related to her husband's failed business, which she conveniently failed to mention when seeking my help." Diane nodded, making notes. "And you believe she's working with someone else to obtain information or access to your assets?" "Based on phone conversations I've overheard, yes." "The timing is interesting," Diane observed. "Your company has grown significantly in the past year. The lake house purchase made local news in the real estate section. Your recent seven-figure deal for Margot Winters was featured in Publishers Weekly. You think Vanessa's appearance is directly related to my public success? I think it's unlikely to be coincidental. Diane leaned forward. Now, about this trust she's mentioned, have you checked with your parents? Could there be a family trust you're unaware of? I shook my head. My relationship with my parents has been distant since Vanessa's transplant. They sided with her version of events, believing I was exaggerating my recovery difficulties for attention. But from what I know, there's no significant family money beyond my father's retirement accounts and their home. Your father's deteriorating health might have prompted them to put into some form of estate planning, Diane suggested. Possibly. But why would Vanessa be asking her ex-boyfriend about it instead of our parents directly? Good question. Diane tapped her pen thoughtfully. Let's draft 2 documents. First, a formal agreement stipulating the temporary nature of your sister's residence, protecting you from any claim she might make regarding tenancy rights. Second, a letter to be sent to your parents' address requesting clarification about any trusts established for their children. The letter to my parents felt extreme, but Diane insisted it was necessary. If there is a trust, and if Vanessa is attempting to manipulate it in some way, creating a paper trail of your reasonable inquiries protects you legally. By noon, both documents were prepared. The residency agreement would be presented to Vanessa that evening, requiring her signature to continue staying in my home. The letter to my parents would be held in reserve, sent only if Vanessa's explanation proved unsatisfactory. Back at the office, Ellie was waiting with the promised information about Jason Stevens. He's filed for bankruptcy protection, as we knew, she began, handing me a folder. But here's what's interesting. 3 weeks ago, he incorporated a new business, Lakeview Property Acquisitions, LLC. I frowned. While in the middle of bankruptcy proceedings? Is that even legal? Technically, yes, if structured correctly. His name doesn't appear on the incorporation documents, but his assistant, Melody Prescott, is listed as the managing partner, the one he allegedly left Vanessa for. What does this company do? On paper, they acquire distressed properties in lakefront communities for renovation and resale. They've already purchased 2 foreclosed properties in Michigan, near your lake house. The implication was concerning. You think Jason is targeting my property somehow? I think it's suspicious that his new girlfriend's company is suddenly interested in properties near yours. At the same time, Vanessa shows up asking about ownership documents. Ellie hesitated. There's more. Vanessa did go to her interview this morning. My contact confirmed it. But afterward, she didn't return directly to your house. She met someone at a cafe in Evanston. Who? A man who matches Jason's description from social media photos. They spoke for approximately 40 minutes, then left separately. So, Vanessa was still in contact with her ex-husband, despite claiming he had abandoned her. The pieces were starting to form a troubling pattern. There's one more thing, Ellie added, looking genuinely concerned now. I did some digging into your parents' property records. Your father established a family trust 6 months ago. The trust includes their home, his retirement accounts, and, according to the publicly filed documents, all interests in real property acquired through family connections. What does that mean? I asked, though a sinking feeling suggested I already knew. It's ambiguous legal language, Ellie admitted, but it could potentially be interpreted to include property purchased with funds derived from family relationships or connections, like a publishing company built during recovery from a kidney donation to a family member, like a lake house purchased with the proceeds of that company. Vanessa's trying to claim my success is partially hers because it stemmed from the transplant, I said slowly, the realization dawning. She and Jason think they can leverage this trust language to make a claim on my assets. It's a stretch legally, Ellie acknowledged. But if your father is as ill as you've mentioned, and if Vanessa has been influencing your parents' perceptions, they might have included language she suggested without understanding the implications. I closed the folder, and my decision was made. Call Diane, tell her to messenger the residence agreement to the house immediately, and send the letter to my parents. Priority mail, signature required. By the time I returned home that evening, I was armed with legal documentation and a clear understanding of what Vanessa was likely planning. The residence agreement waited on my desk, delivered by courier as requested. Now I just needed Vanessa's explanation and to see how much truth it contained. She arrived shortly after 6, her expression a mixture of excitement and barely concealed anxiety. "How was the interview?" I asked casually, meeting her in the kitchen. "Really good, actually. They seemed impressed with my event planning background." She set down her purse. "They want me back for a second interview next week with the general manager." "Congratulations. That's promising." She smiled, some genuine warmth breaking through her nervous facade. "Thank you. It felt good to be taken seriously professionally again. After everything with Jason, my confidence was pretty shattered." "Speaking of Jason," I said, maintaining my casual tone, "how was your meeting with him after the interview?" The color drained from Vanessa's face. "What? I didn't—" "Please don't lie, Vanessa. You were observed meeting him at a cafe in Evanston. 40 minutes of what appeared to be intense conversation." She sank onto one of the kitchen stools, her brief moment of authentic emotion replaced by calculation as she assessed how much I knew. "It's not what you think," she began, the same phrase she'd used the night before. "Then explain what it is," I replied, leaning against the counter, "starting with why you're still in contact with the man who supposedly left you destitute, and why he's suddenly established a property acquisition company focused on lakefront communities like this one." Her eyes widened slightly. "You've been investigating us?" "Of course I have. You showed up at my door unannounced after 5 years of silence, making suspicious phone calls and attempting to access my private office. What did you expect?" Vanessa took a deep breath, seemingly making a decision. "All right, the truth then. Jason and I are still married. The divorce papers were drawn up but never filed." "Why the deception?" "Because we're trying to protect our assets from the investor lawsuit," she admitted. "The business really did fail, but not entirely due to Jason's gambling. Our main investor pulled out at a critical moment, after verbally promising continued support. He's now claiming we misrepresented the company's status, but he's the one who created the crisis." I processed this new information. "So you separated your assets by pretending to divorce, with you portraying yourself as the abandoned wife." "It was Jason's idea," she said quickly. "He thought if I appeared to be an innocent victim, I might be able to salvage something. Possibly even access family resources that wouldn't be subject to the lawsuit." "Resources like my home and company?" She had the grace to look ashamed. "Not exactly. We learned about Dad's trust from his attorney. They needed updated contact information for both beneficiaries. The language about properties acquired through family connections caught Jason's attention. Let me guess. He interpreted that to include my lake house because I purchased it with money earned from a company I built while recovering from donating a kidney to you." Vanessa winced. "It sounds terrible when you put it that way." "Because it is terrible, Vanessa. It's a calculated attempt to claim ownership of something that's exclusively mine, based on a medical procedure I underwent voluntarily. I never wanted to pursue it," she insisted. "But Jason was convinced we could establish a claim. He's desperate, Catherine. The lawsuit could destroy us financially for years to come." "So you decided to destroy me instead?" I kept my voice level, though anger burned beneath the surface. "To show up here, play on my sympathies, and search for documents that might help you steal my home?" "Not steal," she protested weakly. "Just establish partial interest. Maybe negotiate a settlement." I walked to my desk and returned with the residence agreement. "Sign this. It formally acknowledges that your stay here is temporary and establishes that you make no claim whatsoever on this property." She scanned the document, then looked up in alarm. Catherine, this says I have to leave within 48 hours. Your other option is to leave now, I replied coldly. You've been manipulating me from the moment you arrived, Vanessa. Working with the man who supposedly abandoned you to find ways to claim what I've built through years of hard work. It's not that simple, she insisted. Yes, I came here with ulterior motives, but seeing you again, seeing what you've created, it's made me question everything. That's why I met with Jason today. To tell him I couldn't go through with it, I raised a skeptical eyebrow. 40 minutes seems excessive for delivering that simple message. He didn't take it well, she admitted. Threatened to implicate me more heavily in the investor fraud if I didn't cooperate. That's what I wanted to explain tonight. I'm caught between Jason's demands and my own conscience. The desperation in her voice seemed genuine, but Vanessa had always been skilled at presenting herself as a victim when cornered. Sign the agreement, I repeated. You can stay the full 48 hours while you find alternative arrangements. I'll even cover a week at a hotel if necessary. And if I don't sign? Then I call the police and report an unwelcome intruder attempting to fraudulently claim interest in my property. Tears welled in her eyes. After everything we've been through, I gave you the chance to explain last night. Why won't you give me the same opportunity now? Because you've already demonstrated that your explanations are carefully crafted deceptions, I replied. You claim to be divorced when you weren't. You claim to be abandoned when you're still working with Jason. You claimed financial desperation when you're actually executing a calculated plan to claim my assets. Not everything was a lie, she whispered. The business really did fail. We really are facing that lawsuit. I really do need a fresh start. Then sign the agreement and find that fresh start somewhere else, Vanessa. Not by attempting to take what's mine. With a shaking hand, she signed the document. What happens now? Now you have 48 hours to leave. During that time, you'll have access only to the guest suite. The security system has been reprogrammed accordingly. She stood, gathering her composure. I'm sorry it came to this, Catherine. Truly. I know you won't believe me, but I was going to tell Jason we needed to find another way. Seeing you again, realizing how much I threw away 5 years ago, it matters more than some property claim. If that's true, prove it by respecting the agreement you just signed, I replied, unmoved by what could easily be another performance. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. As she retreated to the guest suite, I called Ellie to update her on the situation. She admitted everything, though she claims she was having second thoughts. I've given her 48 hours to leave. Do. You believe her? About the second thoughts? I considered the question seriously. I don't know. There was something in her expression when she talked about realizing what she'd thrown away. But Vanessa has always been convincing when backed into a corner. What about dinner on Saturday? Should we cancel? No, I decided. The gathering serves its purpose either way. If Vanessa is truly remorseful, she'll be gone before then. If not, having witnesses present ensures she can't make any last-minute attempts to establish residency or claim ownership. After hanging up, I stood at the windows overlooking the darkening lake, reflecting on the day's revelations. The discovery of my father's trust with its ambiguous language concerned me deeply. Had Vanessa deliberately influenced the wording, or had my father, in his weakened state, included language that could potentially link my success to the kidney donation without understanding the implications? Either way, the legal letter to my parents would force clarification. If Vanessa was manipulating them, it would be exposed. If they had intentionally structured the trust to potentially include my assets, at least I would know where I stood. The kidney connected us permanently, a biological bond that couldn't be severed. But that connection didn't entitle Vanessa to the life I'd built in the aftermath of her betrayal. Whatever genuine remorse she might feel now couldn't erase 5 years of absence or justify her calculated attempt to claim what wasn't hers. As darkness fell completely over the lake, I considered the 48-hour countdown now ticking away. Would Vanessa leave quietly as agreed, or did she have one final move in this complex game of manipulation and countermoves? Either way, I was prepared, legally, strategically, and emotionally, for whatever came next. Morning arrived with a violent thunderstorm, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rattled the glass. I'd slept poorly, my mind cycling through different scenarios of how the next 48 hours might unfold. Now, wrapped in a cashmere robe and nursing my second cup of coffee, I watched a lightning spider across the turbulent lake while waiting for any sign of movement from the guest suite. The residence agreement sat on my desk, Vanessa's signature, a shaky contrast to her normally confident handwriting. Whatever performance she'd given about having second thoughts, the legal document ensured she couldn't claim any interest in my property. I'd already emailed a copy to Diane as additional protection. My phone chimed with a text from Richard Hayes. Your father has requested an urgent appointment this afternoon. Mentioned family matters that can't wait. Should I be concerned? So the letter had arrived, prompting immediate action from my parents. I texted back, nothing medically concerning. Legal clarification regarding a family trust. Please monitor his stress levels during the appointment. Setting down my phone, I noticed Vanessa standing in the doorway, still in sleep clothes, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I couldn't sleep, she said quietly. Been up since 4 thinking about everything. I gestured to the coffee machine. Help yourself. She poured a cup, then settled into a chair across from me, pulling her knees up to her chest in a gesture reminiscent of our childhood. When we were young, before competition and resentment had colored our relationship, we'd often shared early mornings this way. Vanessa curled up with her thoughts, me with a book, comfortable in shared silence. Dad called last night, she said finally. He was upset. Something about a certified letter regarding the family trust? I nodded without elaborating. She would understand the tactical nature of the letter soon enough. He asked if I knew anything. About it, she continued. I told him I didn't. A rare moment of honesty between you, I observed. She flinched but didn't argue the point. He's going to his attorney today. He thinks you're planning to contest the trust arrangements. I'm planning to clarify them, I corrected. Particularly the ambiguous language about properties acquired through family connections that you and Jason were hoping to exploit. Rain drummed steadily against the windows, creating a strangely intimate atmosphere for this tense conversation. Jason found the trust language, Vanessa admitted. I didn't know about it until after Dad signed the documents, but when Jason pointed it out, she trailed off, staring into her coffee. You saw an opportunity, I finished for her. I saw a potential solution to an impossible situation, she countered softly. The investor lawsuit is real, Catherine. We're looking at financial ruin, possibly even criminal charges if the court finds deliberate fraud. Jason convinced me the trust language was a lifeline. At my expense, yes. Her directness was surprising. At your expense, I let myself believe it was somehow justified, that because your success came after the transplant, I had some legitimate claim. My success came from years of hard work and sacrifice, I said firmly. The transplant was a medical procedure I chose to undergo out of compassion, not a business investment with expected returns. I know that. Deep down, I always knew that. She set her coffee aside. That's what I was trying to tell Jason yesterday. That this plan was wrong. That we needed to face our problems honestly instead of trying to manipulate the trust language to claim what isn't ours. Something in her tone made me pause. There was a resignation there that felt different from her practiced performances. And how did he respond? He threatened me, she said simply. Said if I didn't follow through, he'd make sure I took the fall for the investor fraud. He has documents with my signature on them, approvals for transactions I never actually reviewed. If I don't cooperate, he'll use them to argue I was the primary decision-maker. I studied her carefully, looking for signs of deception. Why would you sign documents without reviewing them? Because I trusted him. Bitterness crept into her voice. Because after the transplant and recovery, I was still dealing with medication, side effects that affected my concentration. Jason offered to handle the paperwork while I focused on getting better. And you never questioned what you were signing? Not until it was too late. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I was a fool, Catherine. A trusting, grateful fool who believed her husband was protecting her while she recovered. Sound familiar? The parallel to my own situation 5 years ago, trusting Vanessa and my parents to support me through my recovery, only to be abandoned, wasn't lost on me. So what are you saying? That Jason manipulated you just as you manipulated me? I'm saying I understand now. Her voice broke slightly. I understand what it feels like to give someone your trust and have them exploit it, to be treated as disposable once you've served your purpose. Rain lashed harder against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was intensifying, mirroring the emotional turbulence in the room. Jason was never going to leave me alone in this, she continued. That's why I had to come here, to try to find something, anything that would give us leverage in the trust situation. But seeing you again, seeing the life you've built after I abandoned you. She shook her head. It changed something in me. Convenient timing for this revelation, I noted, skepticism evident in my tone. I deserve that, she acknowledged. But it's still true. Meeting with Jason yesterday was my attempt to end this scheme before it went any further. I told him I wouldn't help him pursue any claim against you. Which is why you signed the residence agreement without further argument. Yes, and why I'm prepared to leave as agreed. She took a deep breath. But before I go, there's something else you need to know. About Mom and Dad, and about what really happened 5 years ago. My pulse quickened slightly. What about them? They didn't side with me over your recovery issues because they believed I was right, she said quietly. They did it because I threatened to cut them off from contact with me if they supported you. The revelation hit with unexpected force. For 5 years, I'd believed my parents had simply chosen Vanessa's version of events over mine, a continuation of the lifelong pattern of her being the favorite. The idea that she had actively manipulated them through emotional blackmail was both better and worse than what I'd imagined. After everything they did to support me through kidney failure and transplantation, they were terrified of losing access to me, she continued. I exploited that fear. Told them your complaints about recovery were attempts to redirect attention back to you, that supporting you would damage my recovery by causing stress. I struggled to find words adequate to the betrayal. Cruel, manipulative, unforgivable. She supplied the adjectives I couldn't voice. All of that and worse. I convinced myself it was justified because I needed to move forward, to focus on my new life with Jason without the constant reminder of what you'd sacrificed for me. Why tell me this now? Because you deserve to know that your parents didn't choose me over you. I forced their hand. And because I've recently learned that Dad's heart condition was likely exacerbated by the stress of being caught between us. Her eyes filled with tears. Richard believes the emotional strain of the family rift contributed significantly to his cardiac deterioration. The weight of this new information settled heavily. For years, I'd harbored resentment toward my parents for their perceived abandonment, never considering they might have been victims of Vanessa's manipulation as much as I was. Does Dad know about your plan to use the trust language against me? I asked. She shook her head. No. He included that language at Jason's suggestion. Jason called him about estate planning concerns last fall, posing as a concerned son-in-law. Dad had no idea it could be interpreted to include your property or business. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from my attorney. Excuse me, I need to take this. Stepping into my office, I closed the door before answering. Diane, what's the update? I've reviewed the actual trust documents, she replied without preamble. Your sister's ex, or current husband Jason Stevens, contacted your father's estate attorney last October, suggesting specific language about family connections that should be included. The attorney has notes indicating Stevens presented it as protecting certain inheritance rights for potential grandchildren. So my father had no idea the language could potentially apply to my assets? Apparently not. I've spoken directly with his attorney, who was quite concerned when I explained the potential interpretation. He's meeting with your parents this afternoon to clarify and amend the language. Thank you, Diane. This is exactly what I needed to know. After hanging up, I remained at my desk, processing the implications of Vanessa's confession alongside Diane's confirmation. The manipulations ran deeper than I'd imagined, with Jason orchestrating much of what had transpired over the past year. When I returned to the main room, Vanessa was standing at the windows, watching the storm. The rain had lessened slightly, though dark clouds still hung low over the lake. Your attorney confirmed it, didn't she? Vanessa asked without turning. About Jason suggesting the trust language to Dad? Yes. He presented it as protecting inheritance rights for potential grandchildren. She nodded, unsurprised. He told me he'd handled it, but wouldn't elaborate on how. I should have pressed for details. Why didn't you? Because by then, I was already looking for ways out of the marriage. She turned to face me. The business was failing. Jason was becoming increasingly secretive, and I was finally beginning to see the pattern of manipulation that had defined our relationship from the start. I considered her words carefully. The vulnerability she was displaying felt genuine, but trust came with difficulty after so many deceptions. What about the pending lawsuit? I asked. Is that part of why you're here? Hoping I'll help financially? No, she said firmly. I made this mess. I'll handle the consequences. I have the interview call back at Lakeside, and I've applied for several other positions. If I can establish steady income, I might be able to negotiate a settlement with the investor. And Jason? If he has documents implicating you in the fraud? Her expression hardened. Then I'll face that too. I've spoken with a criminal attorney about my options. There's evidence Jason deliberately kept me in the dark about certain transactions while using my signature. It won't absolve me completely, but it might mitigate the consequences. The determined set of her jaw reminded me of the Vanessa I'd known before her illness, the sister who'd faced challenges head-on rather than manipulating situations to her advantage. What will you do now? I asked. Where will you go when you leave tomorrow? I've booked a room at the extended stay in Evanston, she replied. It's not glamorous, but it's affordable while I get back on my feet. A complicated mixture of emotions churned within me. Lingering anger and distrust alongside a reluctant recognition of what appeared to be genuine remorse. The sister standing before me seemed caught between the manipulative person who had abandoned me and someone struggling toward accountability. I'd like to see the documents Jason has, I said finally. The ones with your signature that he's threatening to use against you. Surprise flickered across her face. Why? Because if you're telling the truth about being manipulated, there might be legal options to protect you that don't involve sacrificing my property or business. You would help me? After everything? I'm not making any promises, I cautioned. But if Jason manipulated both you and our father with the intention of leveraging the trust against me, that constitutes a pattern of fraudulent behavior that might be relevant to your legal defense. Hope bloomed cautiously in her expression. I have copies of some documents in my suitcase, financial approvals that I supposedly signed during periods when I was hospitalized for transplant complications. Get them, I instructed. I'll have Diane review them. As Vanessa hurried to retrieve the documents, my phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. Breaking news. Jason Stevens arrested this morning by FBI. Securities fraud investigations separate from investor lawsuit. Appears federal authorities have been building a case for months. I stared at the message, stunned by the timing. A moment later, Vanessa returned with a folder, her phone clutched in her other hand, face pale with shock. "Jason's been arrested," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Federal charges. Something about securities violations beyond the investor issues we knew about." "How much did you know about his business operations?" I asked carefully. "Clearly not enough." She sank onto the sofa, a folder forgotten in her lap. "The FBI has been investigating him for months, according to this news alert. They're alleging he was running a modified Ponzi scheme, using new investor funds to pay returns to earlier investors while siphoning millions for personal use." The magnitude of what Vanessa had become entangled in was beginning to emerge. Either she was an exceptionally skilled actor maintaining a years-long deception, or she had been manipulated far more extensively than either of us had realized. "These are the documents?" I indicated the folder. She nodded, handing it over mechanically, still processing the news of Jason's arrest. Inside were financial approvals for transactions totaling over $3 million, all bearing Vanessa's signature. What caught my attention, however, were the dates. 3 of the largest approvals were signed during periods when, according to medical records included in the folder, Vanessa had been hospitalized for complications related to her transplant. "You were in the hospital when these were supposedly signed," I observed. "Heavily medicated for an infection that nearly shut down the kidney," she confirmed. "I have no memory of seeing these documents, let alone signing them. Jason had power of attorney during my recovery. He must have used it to approve these transactions in my name." I took photos of the documents and sent them to Diane with a brief explanation, then returned the folder to Vanessa. "The FBI will want to see these," I told her. "They establish a pattern of Jason acting without your knowledge, potentially against your interests." She looked up, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "They'll probably contact me soon, won't they? As his business partner and wife." "Most likely. Which means you need legal representation immediately." "I can't afford a good attorney," she said bleakly. "Everything's frozen in the bankruptcy proceedings." I made a decision that surprised even me. "I'll cover the initial consultation with a criminal defense attorney I know, someone who specializes in cases where one partner is manipulated into unwitting participation in fraud." "Why would you do that?" Genuine confusion colored her voice. "After everything I've done?" I considered the question carefully. "Because if you're telling the truth about being manipulated by Jason, then we have that in common. And because that kidney is still keeping you alive, regardless of what happened afterward." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't deserve your help." "Probably not," I agreed. "But there's a difference between what people deserve and what they need. 5 years ago, I needed support during my recovery and didn't get it. I won't be the person who withholds help when it's within my power to provide it." The storm outside had begun to subside, patches of blue appearing between the dark clouds. As if on cue, my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. "I should take this," I said, moving toward my office. Vanessa nodded, wiping her eyes. "Tell him I'm sorry for everything, and that I'll call him tonight to explain." As I closed the office door, preparing to speak with my father for the first time in months about matters we'd long avoided, I realized that the 48-hour countdown had become somewhat irrelevant. Jason's arrest and the emerging evidence of his manipulations had fundamentally altered the situation. Whatever happened next, whether Vanessa stayed or left, whether my parents and I rebuilt our relationship, whether the legal issues surrounding Jason's fraud were resolved quickly or dragged on for years, one thing was becoming clear. The kidney I'd donated 5 years ago hadn't just saved Vanessa's life. In a strange way, it had created an unbreakable connection that was now forcing all of us to confront truths we'd long avoided. Answering my father's call, I prepared to begin a conversation that was long overdue. "Catherine?" My father's voice sounded older than I remembered, a slight tremor betraying both his physical condition and emotional state. "We received your letter about the trust. I settled into my desk chair, steeling myself for the conversation ahead. Yes, I needed clarification about certain provisions. You could have just called, he said, a hint of reproach in his tone. A formal legal letter seems excessive for family matters. Does it? I kept my voice neutral. We've barely spoken. In 5 years, Dad. The last time I raised concerns about family matters, you told me I was being dramatic for attention. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Finally, he sighed. We made mistakes, Catherine. Your mother and I. We didn't handle things well after the transplant. No, you didn't. The calm conviction in my voice surprised even me. Years of therapy had helped me process the abandonment, but I'd never expected to address it so directly with my father. You chose Vanessa's version of events over mine, even when medical evidence supported what I was telling you. It wasn't that simple, he protested weakly. Vanessa was still recovering. Her immune system was compromised. The doctors emphasized how critical it was to minimize her stress. And maximizing mine was an acceptable cost? Another pause. No, it wasn't. His admission hung in the air between us. We've just spoken with our attorney about the trust language. I want you to know I never intended it to apply to your property or business. Jason suggested the wording about family connections as protection for future grandchildren. I know. My attorney confirmed that this morning. I softened my tone slightly. Dad, has Vanessa told you why she's staying with me? She mentioned having some financial difficulties after separating from Jason. His voice held uncertainty. She didn't want to worry us with the details given my condition. The situation is significantly more complicated than that, I said carefully. You should know that Jason was arrested this morning by federal authorities for securities fraud. The business bankruptcy involves allegations of deliberate misrepresentation to investors. My God, he breathed. Is Vanessa involved? That's being determined. There's evidence suggesting Jason may have forged her signature on critical documents while she was hospitalized for transplant complications. The sound of my father's labored breathing filled the line. I need to call her. She's here, I assured him. She's safe, and I'm connecting her with appropriate legal counsel. But Dad, there's something else you should know. The reason Vanessa came to me wasn't just for a place to stay. She and Jason initially planned to use the trust language to try to claim an interest in my property. His sharp intake of breath was audible. She wouldn't do that. She's admitted it, I countered gently, though she now claims she was trying to back out of the plan when Jason was arrested. Catherine, he began, then stopped. When he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. We failed you both, in different ways. The raw admission cracked something in my carefully maintained composure. Yes, you did. But that's not why I sent the letter, Dad. I needed legal clarity about the trust to protect myself, not to assign blame. The language is being amended today, he assured me. Our attorney is drafting new provisions that explicitly exclude any claim on assets you've acquired independently. Thank you. An awkward silence stretched between us, 5 years of distance creating a chasm neither of us quite knew how to bridge. Your mother wants to speak with you, he said finally. She's been carrying this weight for a long time. The prospect of speaking with my mother, who had been even more dismissive of my post-donation struggles than my father, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I'm not sure I'm ready for that conversation. I understand. His voice softened. But when you are ready, she'll be here. We both will. After promising to keep him updated about Vanessa's situation and agreeing to call again soon, I ended the call feeling emotionally drained yet strangely lighter. Confronting the past hadn't been as catastrophic as I'd feared. When I emerged from my office, Vanessa was still on the sofa, scrolling through news reports about Jason's arrest on her phone. Her face was pale, her expression stunned. The charges are serious, she said without looking up. Securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. They're estimating he misappropriated over $4 million from investors. I sat across from her. How much did you know about the business finances? I thought I knew everything. She set down her Rawa phone. I had access to the company accounts, reviewed the quarterly reports. But these charges reference offshore accounts and shell companies I've never heard of. The FBI will want to know that. She nodded grimly. I've already received a call from an Agent Pearson. They want me to come in tomorrow morning for questioning. Fear flickered across her face. What if they don't believe I was in the dark? What if they think I was complicit? That's why you need proper legal representation. I checked my watch. I've arranged for you to speak with Caroline Weiss at 3 o'clock. She's one of the best criminal defense attorneys in Chicago, specializing in cases involving spousal manipulation. Gratitude and shame warred on Vanessa's face. I don't know how to thank you. Don't, I said simply. This isn't about gratitude. It's about ensuring the truth comes out, whatever that truth may be. My phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. Workshop materials finalized. Authors confirmed for Saturday. One other thing. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune calling about Jay Stevens' arrest, asking if we can confirm his wife is staying with you. How to respond. I showed the message to Vanessa. The press is already connecting the dots. Of course they are, she said bitterly. The wife of an alleged fraudster hiding out at her successful sister's lakefront mansion. It practically writes itself. We need to get ahead of this narrative, I decided, texting Ellie back. No comment on personal matters. Refer any press inquiries to our standard media contact protocol. The day unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. While Vanessa spoke with Caroline Weiss by video conference from my home office, I worked from the kitchen, rearranging meetings and preparing for potential media scrutiny. The residence agreement with its 48-hour deadline now seemed both irrelevant and premature. Vanessa couldn't leave immediately with an FBI interview scheduled, yet the legal protection it provided was more important than ever. By late afternoon, the initial shock had given way to pragmatic planning. Caroline Weiss called to brief me after her conversation with Vanessa. I don't typically discuss client matters with third parties, she began. But since you're covering my retainer and Vanessa has explicitly waived confidentiality for this call, I can tell you my preliminary assessment. I appreciate that, I replied, stepping onto the patio for privacy. Based on the documents she's shown me and her medical records from the post-transplant period, there's a strong case for her being an unwitting participant rather than an active conspirator, Caroline continued. The forged signatures during her hospitalization are particularly compelling evidence. Will that be enough to protect her from charges? Possibly, though it depends on how aggressively the prosecutors want to pursue all connected parties. I've arranged to accompany her to tomorrow's FBI interview. My goal is to position her as a potential witness against Jason rather than a co-defendant. After thanking Caroline and confirming the payment arrangements, I rejoined Vanessa in the kitchen. The afternoon had taken a toll on her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her normally perfect posture had collapsed into exhaustion. Caroline thinks I might avoid charges if I cooperate fully, she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Though the investor lawsuit is still proceeding regardless of the criminal case. One battle at a time, I advised, setting a cup of tea in front of her. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. I keep thinking about when we were kids. Do you remember how you always had a plan for everything? Emergency preparedness kits in your backpack? Multiple routes mapped to every destination? The memory brought an unexpected smile. Mom called me her little catastrophist. I used to think it was weird, Vanessa admitted, until that camping trip when Dad got lost hiking and you were the only one who knew exactly what to do, had the whistle, the compass, the emergency contact information. I was 12, I recalled. You were 14 and insisted you were perfectly capable of leading the rescue mission yourself. I was an idiot, she said with a genuine laugh. I would have led us deeper into the woods. You always had a clearer perspective, even then. The conversation felt surreal, sharing childhood memories while federal charges and investor lawsuits hung over our heads. Yet there was something healing about reconnecting with aspects of our relationship that predated the transplant, the betrayal, and the years of estrangement. "What happens now?" Vanessa asked, setting down her tea. "With us, I mean. After the FBI interview, after the legal issues are sorted, if they ever are." I considered the question carefully. "I don't know. 5 years of silence can't be erased by a few days of crisis, no matter how revealing." "I understand that," she said quietly. "I wouldn't expect forgiveness. I miss having a sister." The simple statement pierced something in me. Before the transplant, before the betrayal, we had been sisters. Competitive sometimes, different always, but connected in ways that went beyond our shared DNA. The kidney I'd donated had saved her life, but somehow severed that connection, creating a debt that had warped our relationship beyond recognition. "Let's focus on getting through the immediate legal issues," I suggested, unwilling to make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "Then we can think about what comes next." She nodded, accepting this measured response without pushing for more. "Auntie." Phone rang. Margot Winters calling about Saturday's gathering. "I need to take this," I said, grateful for the interruption. While discussing final arrangements with Margot, I wandered to the windows overlooking the lake. The storm had cleared completely, leaving a golden late-afternoon light across the water. 3 sailboats tacked against the breeze, their white sails bright against the blue expanse. "One more thing," Margot said, before ending the call. "I'm bringing the manuscript of my new memoir for your feedback. The chapter about found family versus blood relations. I think you'll find it relevant to your own experience." After hanging up, I remained at the window, contemplating Margot's comment. She didn't know about Vanessa or the transplant. No one in my professional circle did. Yet she had sensed something in me that resonated with her exploration of chosen versus biological family bonds. The question of what constituted true family, obligation, shared history, active choice, biological connection, had hovered at the edges of my consciousness since Vanessa's arrival. The kidney connected us in ways that couldn't be undone, yet that physical link hadn't been enough to sustain our relationship through crisis. Vanessa appeared beside me at the window, respecting my silence as we watched the sailboats together. "Remember when Dad used to take us sailing on Lake Michigan?" she asked finally. "You loved it. I was always terrified we'd capsize. But you came anyway," she observed. "Every time." "Family obligation," I said lightly. She shook her head. "No, you came because despite being afraid, you didn't want to miss out on the experience. That's always been your way, facing fears head-on instead of avoiding them." The assessment was surprisingly insightful, recognizing a core aspect of my personality that even my closest colleagues rarely noted. "Is that why you think I donated my kidney?" I asked. "Fear of missing the experience?" "No." She turned to face me. "You donated your kidney because beneath all your practical planning and careful risk assessment, you love deeply. Too deeply, sometimes. Enough to literally give a piece of yourself away." The simple truth of it silenced me. I had loved my sister enough to undergo major surgery, to sacrifice an organ, to risk my own health, not out of obligation, but from that deep well of connection we'd once shared. "I should have treasured that gift," Vanessa continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just the kidney, but the love behind it. Instead, I treated both as something I was entitled to, then discarded when they became inconvenient." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an urgent news alert. "Breaking. Jason Stevens allegedly implicated family members in fraud scheme, according to sources close to investigation." I showed Vanessa the alert, watching her face pale. He's trying to drag me down with him, she whispered. Or our parents, I realized suddenly. The trust language about family connections. If Jason claims Dad was knowingly involved in creating that language to help defraud investors, Dad could be implicated too. Horror dawned in Vanessa's eyes. Jason knows about Dad's heart condition. He knows this kind of stress could kill him. The calculated cruelty of it aligned perfectly with the pattern of manipulation Jason had demonstrated throughout. Now cornered by federal charges, he was apparently willing to deploy any leverage available, including endangering the health of his father-in-law. I need to call Caroline, Vanessa said urgently. If Jason is trying to implicate family members, she needs to know before tomorrow's FBI interview. While she made the call, I contacted my father's cardiologist. Richard, it's Catherine again. There's been a development you should be aware of given Dad's condition. After explaining the situation, I added, Is there any way you could check on him this evening? I'm concerned about the impact when this news reaches him. I'll go now, Richard promised. Your parents live 10 minutes from my home. I'll call you after I've assessed the situation. By the time Vanessa finished her call with Caroline, I had arranged for Richard to visit our parents and for Diane to prepare a statement categorically denying any family involvement in Jason's business activities. Caroline says I need to provide a complete timeline of my hospital stays and recovery periods, Vanessa reported, her organizational skills emerging in the crisis. Medical records showing when I was incapacitated, correspondence demonstrating Jason's control over financial matters during those times. My office has resources that can help compile that information efficiently, I offered. Ellie is excellent at creating detailed chronologies for legal proceedings. Vanessa's gratitude was evident, but so was her determination. I need to do this myself, she insisted. I got myself into this situation. I need to be the one to gather the evidence that might get me out. I respected her resolve, recognizing that taking responsibility was an essential step in whatever redemption she was seeking. Use my home office. It has better equipment than the guest suite. The door code is 7294. Her eyes widened slightly at this unexpected extension of trust. Thank you. As she headed toward my previously off-limits office, I called Ellie to update her on the situation. We need to prepare for possible media attention if Jason follows through on implicating family members, I explained. Draft holding statements for both the company and me personally, and reschedule tomorrow's client meetings. I'll need to, accompany Vanessa to the FBI interview. Already on it, Ellie assured me. And Catherine? For what it's worth, I think you're handling this with remarkable grace. The comment caught me off guard. Grace was not a quality I typically associated with my approach to crisis management, efficiency perhaps, or strategic thinking. But grace implied a generosity of spirit I wasn't sure I possessed, particularly where Vanessa was concerned. As evening descended over the lake, I prepared a simple dinner while Vanessa worked diligently in my office, the roles from our childhood, curiously reversed. Once, she had been the center of attention while I worked quietly in the background. Now, I was the established professional extending help from a position of security, while she struggled to rebuild from catastrophic choices. The kidney that connected us had set in motion a complex sequence of events that neither of us could have anticipated. What had begun as a medical necessity had evolved into a symbol of everything broken in our relationship: obligation, resentment, abandonment, and now perhaps the tentative possibility of healing. Tomorrow would bring the FBI interview and whatever new challenges Jason's desperate allegations created. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of revelations and reconnections, we were simply two sisters sharing the same space again after years apart, each wary, each wounded, but both confronting the fractured foundation of our relationship with eyes finally open to truths long avoided. 3 months had passed since Vanessa first appeared on my doorstep that rainy evening. The lakefront property now basked in late summer sunshine, wildflowers dotting the gently sloping lawn that led down to the water. I sat on the dock, bare, feet dangling above the gentle waves, reviewing manuscript notes for Margot's forthcoming memoir. So much had changed since that night. Jason remained in federal custody, denied bail due to flight risk after authorities discovered preparations for an escape to a non-extradition country. The FBI investigation had expanded to include his business associates, but Vanessa had been officially cleared of criminal liability following her cooperation and the compelling evidence of forgery during her hospitalization periods. The civil lawsuit from investors remained active, but had been modified to remove Vanessa as a primary defendant, naming her instead as a co-victim of Jason's fraud. Her legal team, led by Caroline Weiss and funded through a payment plan we'd worked out together, had successfully argued that she too had been deceived about the company's true financial status. "There you are," called a familiar voice from the lawn. I turned to see Ellie approaching, tablet in hand. "Hiding from the party preparations?" "Strategic retreat," I corrected with a smile. 3 authors and 2 editors discussing cover design concepts became too heated for spectators. Ellie laughed, settling beside me on the dock. In the months since the crisis, our professional relationship had evolved into something closer to friendship. She'd been an unwavering support throughout the media attention that followed Jason's arrest and the subsequent legal proceedings. "Final guest count for tonight is 22, she reported. "The caterers arrive at 4. Oh, and Margot wants to know if she can read an excerpt from the memoir during dinner." "As long as it's not the chapter about me," I replied, only half joking. Margot had eventually learned about Vanessa and the transplant during the investigation's media coverage, incorporating themes from our reconciliation into her memoir on family bonds. "Speaking of family," Ellie said carefully, "Vanessa called. Her flight from Indianapolis lands at 3. She asked if you need her to bring anything for the gathering." I shook my head. "Everything's arranged, though you might remind her to bring the photo albums she mentioned." After the initial FBI interview and legal consultations, Vanessa had returned to Indianapolis temporarily, not to reunite with Jason, but to collect evidence, close their shared apartment, and testify before the grand jury. What was planned? As a week-long trip had extended to 3 months as she worked with federal investigators to untangle the web of Jason's financial manipulations. We'd spoken almost daily during her absence, rebuilding our relationship one conversation at a time. The process hadn't been smooth, old patterns and resentments occasionally surfaced, but the foundation felt more honest than anything we'd shared in years. "She sounds excited about the job offer," Ellie remarked, referring to the position Vanessa had recently been offered with a Chicago-based event planning firm. "Will she be staying here when she relocates?" "Temporarily," I confirmed. "The guest house renovation should be finished by next month. It will give her independence while she gets established." The decision to convert my property's original caretaker cottage into a guest house had emerged naturally as Vanessa and I discussed her future. The separate residence would provide appropriate boundaries while allowing us to continue rebuilding our relationship without the pressure of constant proximity. Ellie checked her watch. "I should head back up. The florist needs final approval on the centerpieces." As she departed, I returned to Margot's manuscript, though my thoughts drifted to the evening ahead. Tonight's gathering marked the 1-year anniversary of Mitchell, Literary Management's Lake House Writers' Retreats. The program we'd launched immediately after the crisis with Vanessa and Jason had stabilized. What had begun as a strategic move to have witnesses present during a potentially volatile situation with my sister had evolved into one of our agency's most successful initiatives. Monthly weekend retreats now brought authors together for collaboration and creative renewal, generating several notable projects including a multi-author anthology that had recently hit the bestseller lists. More significantly, tonight would be the first time my parents visited the lake house. After months of cautious reconnection, first through phone calls, then brief meetings in neutral locations, they had accepted my invitation to the anniversary celebration. The prospect of hosting them alongside my professional circle and Vanessa felt both terrifying and strangely right, a convergence of the separate lives I'd maintained for years. My phone chimed with a message from Richard Hayes. "Just checking. Your father's medication schedule shouldn't conflict with dinner timing. Call if you need any adjustments to his evening doses." Richard had remained involved with our family beyond his professional capacity as my father's cardiologist. His steady support during the investigation, particularly his expert testimony about Vanessa's medical incapacitation during key financial transactions, had proved invaluable. More surprisingly, he and I had developed a friendship that occasionally verged on something more, though neither of us had yet acknowledged that potential explicitly. Gathering my materials, I headed back to the main house, where preparation for the evening's event was in full swing. Florists arranged dramatic centerpieces featuring late summer blooms, caterers bustled in the kitchen, and staff positioned additional seating on the expansive patio overlooking the lake. In my bedroom, I found the dress I'd selected for the evening, a deep blue silk that complemented my eyes without being overly formal. As I prepared for the gathering, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror and paused, struck by the physical evidence of how much had changed. 5 years ago, during my difficult recovery from the kidney donation, I'd lost weight dramatically, my body weakened by complications and my spirit crushed by Vanessa's abandonment. The woman who stared back at me now looked strong, well-nourished, confident, a transformation that reflected not just professional success, but personal healing. My phone rang. My mother called. "We're about 30 minutes away," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor that had developed over the past year. "Your father is insisting we don't need directions, but I wanted to check if we should take the Lakeshore Road or come through town." I provided detailed guidance, suppressing a smile at my father's unchanged stubbornness about navigation. Some things remained consistent, even as our relationships evolved. "And Catherine," my mother added hesitantly, "thank you for inviting us. It means more than I can express." The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected emotion. For years, I'd believed my parents were incapable of recognizing the pain their choices had caused me. Their gradual steps toward accountability over recent months, facilitated partly by family therapy sessions Richard had gently suggested, had begun healing wounds I'd thought permanent. "I'm glad you're coming," I replied, meaning it. After hanging up, I completed my preparations and headed downstairs to oversee final arrangements. The first guests, Margot and her husband, arrived precisely at 6, followed by a steady stream of authors, editors, and industry contacts who had supported the agency through its growth. Vanessa arrived directly from the airport, slightly disheveled but radiant with a newfound confidence. The months of legal proceedings and soul-searching had transformed her almost as much as her original illness had. Gone was the polished facade that had once defined her. In its place was something more authentic, more grounded. "Sorry I'm late," she said, embracing me. Airplane mode prevented me from getting updates. "How are you feeling about tonight?" "Surprisingly calm," I admitted. "Though ask me again when Mom and Dad arrive." She squeezed my hand. "They're nervous too, you know. Dad changed his shirt 3 times this morning, according to Mom's text." The image of our father, usually so decisive, fretting over his appearance, made us both smile. As we moved through the gathering, introducing Vanessa to colleagues she hadn't yet met, I was struck by how naturally she fit into this aspect of my life. The sister who had once seemed determined to separate herself from me now engaged enthusiastically with my professional world. "Catherine!" called a familiar voice from the entryway. I turned to see my parents standing somewhat uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. My father looked frailer than when I'd last seen him 2 weeks ago, leaning more heavily on his cane, while my mother maintained the carefully composed expression that had been her hallmark throughout our childhood. Vanessa and I crossed the room together, presenting a united front that would have been unimaginable 4 months ago. "You made it," I said, embracing first my mother, then carefully hugging my father, mindful of his balance. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied gruffly, emotion making his voice raspier than usual. "Beautiful place you've created here, Catherine." "Really? Stunning," my mother agreed, taking in the lake view through the wall of windows. "You've accomplished so much." The simple acknowledgement, recognizing my achievements without qualification or comparison to Vanessa, felt like a breakthrough. Throughout childhood, any recognition had always been tempered with reminders not to outshine my sister. Now my success was being celebrated on its own terms. As the evening progressed, I observed the curious merging of my separate worlds, professional colleagues chatting with my parents, Vanessa deep in conversation with Margot about the memoir project, Richard discussing cardiac health with an author researching a medical thriller. The boundaries I'd maintained so rigorously for years had dissolved, creating a more integrated life than I'd believed possible. After dinner, as golden sunset light streamed through the windows, Margot clinked her glass for attention. "I'd like to propose a toast," she announced, "to Catherine, who has not only built an extraordinary agency, but has created this community of writers and thinkers. Your vision has made all of this possible." Glasses raised around the room, followed by warm applause. My father caught my eye across the table, his pride evident. Beside him, my mother wiped away a discreet tear. "If I may," Vanessa said, rising, unexpectedly. "I'd like to add something." She looked directly at me, her expression open and vulnerable. "My sister has always been the strongest person I know, though I haven't always acknowledged that strength. Catherine, you've taught me that resilience isn't just about surviving challenges. It's about creating something meaningful from them." The Bite room had grown quiet, guests aware of witnessing something significant, though most didn't know our full history. When life took something from you, Vanessa's hand drifted unconsciously to her side where the transplanted kidney resided. "You didn't become bitter. You built. You created it. You flourished. Thank you for showing me that's possible, and for giving me the chance to learn from your example." The simple tribute, delivered without melodrama or excessive sentimentality, perfectly captured our journey. We had moved beyond the raw emotions of betrayal and reconciliation to something more sustainable, mutual respect based on genuine understanding rather than obligation or guilt. Later, as the gathering transitioned to the patio for dessert and coffee, my father requested a moment alone. We walked slowly along the perimeter of the property, his cane tapping gently against the stone path. "I need to say something," he began, his voice steadier than I'd heard in months. "Something I should have said years ago." I waited, allowing him the space to find his words. "I failed you after the transplant," he said simply. "Failed to see what you were going through, failed to support you when you needed it most. There's no excuse that justifies that failure." "Dad?" He raised his hand slightly. "Please, let me finish. I've had a lot of time to think, especially since the heart attack last year. When you face your mortality, you gain clarity about what matters." He paused, gathering strength. "I was wrong to prioritize Vanessa's needs so completely that I ignored yours. Wrong to dismiss your suffering. Wrong to let 5 years pass without addressing the damage." The directness of his acknowledgement left me momentarily speechless. Throughout our careful reconciliation of recent months, he had approached the subject obliquely, never confronting his role in my abandonment so explicitly. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, "but I want you to know that I see you now, your strength, your accomplishments, your incredible compassion, the woman you've become despite the failures of those who should have supported you." Emotion threatened to overwhelm me. "I needed to hear that," I managed finally. "For a long time, I thought you and Mom simply valued Vanessa more, that my sacrifice was expected while her needs were paramount." "We failed you both," he said quietly. "Vanessa too, though differently. By treating her as perpetually fragile, we enabled her worst tendencies and stunted her growth. He gazed out at the lake, now burnished with sunset colors. Watching her these past months, taking responsibility, facing consequences, rebuilding with dignity, I've realized how much of a disservice our protection did to her. The insight surprised me. I'd never considered that my parents' preferential treatment might have ultimately harmed Vanessa as much as it had hurt me. "We're all learning," I offered, finding compassion where I'd once held only resentment. He nodded, then reached for my hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it momentarily startled me. "I'm proud of you, Catherine. Not just for your success, but for the person you are. I should have told you that every day." We rejoined the gathering as twilight settled over the lake, finding Vanessa and my mother engaged in animated conversation with Richard and Margot. The sight, once unimaginable, of my reconstructed family integrated with my chosen one filled me with quiet contentment. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Vanessa approached with the photo albums she'd brought from Indianapolis. "I found these while cleaning out the apartment," she explained. "Thought you might want to look through them together sometime." The albums contained photos from our childhood and adolescence, tangible reminders of the connection we'd shared, before illness, donation, and betrayal had complicated everything. "I'd like that," I replied. My parents decided to stay in town overnight rather than driving back in darkness, promising to return for brunch the following day. As they prepared to leave for their hotel, my mother embraced me with unexpected fierceness. "We're so grateful for this second chance," she whispered, "with both our daughters." After the last guests departed and the catering staff finished cleaning, Vanessa and I found ourselves alone on the patio, watching moonlight create a silver path across the dark water. "It went well," she observed, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Better than I expected," I agreed. "Though I'm exhausted from navigating so many different relationships in one space." She laughed softly. "You managed it beautifully. Everyone clearly adores you. Your authors, your staff, even that handsome doctor who couldn't keep his eyes off you all evening." I felt a blush rise that had nothing to do with the evening wine. "Richard and I are just friends." "For now," she teased, then grew more serious. "Thank you for making space for all of this, Catherine. For Mom and Dad. For me. For the possibility of healing what was broken." "I'm not doing it for you," I said honestly. "Or for them. I'm doing it because I don't want to carry that weight anymore. The anger, the resentment. It served its purpose, protecting me when I needed protection. But now it's just heavy." She nodded, understanding. "What happens next? With all of us?" It was the question that had hovered unspoken throughout the evening. What form our reconstituted family might take after so much damage and tentative repair. "We keep doing the work," I said simply. "Day by day, conversation by conversation. We build something new that acknowledges what happened without being defined by it. And us? You and me?" I considered it carefully. "We'll never go back to who we were before the transplant, Vanessa. That's not possible, and maybe not even desirable. But I think we're creating something more honest now. A relationship based on who we actually are rather than who we were expected to be." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "The kidney connects us," she said finally, "physically, biologically. But everything else, the real connection, that's a choice we make every day." "Yes," I agreed. "And today, I'm choosing it." We sat in companionable silence, the gentle lap of waves against the shore marking time's passage. The kidney I'd donated had saved her life. The crisis that followed had nearly destroyed us both. Yet somehow, through all the pain and reckoning, we'd arrived at this moment of quiet understanding. The donation that had once symbolized all we'd lost now represented something different, the beginning of a more authentic connection, one built on truth rather than obligation. My sister had demanded my kidney, then ghosted me when the sacrifice became inconvenient. Now, years later, she needed a place to stay. What neither of us had anticipated was that in offering that shelter, I would ultimately find my own healing. Audiai. Moonlight silvered the lake before us. I realized we had come full circle, not back to where we started, but to a new beginning grounded in the wisdom gained from all we'd endured. The journey hadn't ended. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in years, I faced that future with hope, rather than resignation, grateful for the unexpected gift hidden within what had once seemed only loss. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.